Take your seat, please. Don't hesitate, please. Virginie. Virginie. Thank you very much. Some of you, maybe John can sit too. Hello, John. Please, could you sit? So, thank you very much. Thank you. And silence, thank you very much. Could you now stay up, please? Thank you. Thank you very much. You can sit and thank you for the jury. Permettez-moi de vous lire rapidement un petit message que nous recevons de la part d'un membre du jury qui n'a pas pu nous rejoindre, Aminata Traoré, qui est victime d'un problème grave du dos et qui doit se soigner. Elle nous dit, chers amis et membres du jury du Tribunal Russell sur la Palestine, c'est avec un profond regret que j'ai dû renoncer à participer à la deuxième session internationale du Tribunal Russell sur la Palestine à Londres. La gravité des événements qui se sont déroulés depuis la première session à Barcelone, dont notamment l'attaque de la flottille, ainsi que l'importance de la responsabilité des multinationales dans le drame palestinien, m'incitaient à être présente. Je tenais tout particulièrement à revoir et à saluer Mariette Maguire pour l'acte de courage qu'elle a posé en tentant d'acheminer à son tour à Gaza des biens dont ses habitants sont privés. Je souhaite donc un franc succès aux travaux en cours et me promets de prendre ma place parmi vous. Avec mes meilleures salutations, Aminata Traoré. Je voulais aussi vous dire deux choses avant de passer la parole à la présidente. La première, c'était que vous allez rentrer chez vous demain ou ce soir. Vous allez, après avoir assisté aux travaux du tribunal, vous allez devoir rendre compte. L'importance de rendre compte, c'est de pouvoir à la fois appeler un journaliste, à la fois appeler un parlementaire, à la fois appeler un membre d'un cabinet d'un gouvernement ou un ministre si vous en avez l'occasion. Et c'est de lui transmettre, pas seulement des impressions, mais de lui dire que vous êtes prêt à lui transmettre des informations qui sont celles que nous collectons ici grâce à tous ces témoignages, grâce à toute l'expertise que nous accumulons, grâce aux conclusions qui vont être tirées par le tribunal. Le tribunal est une initiative populaire et seule l'initiative populaire, aujourd'hui, peut et doit nous amener à faire prendre conscience aux opinions publiques sur le plan international de la gravité des situations, mais pas seulement de la gravité de ces situations, du sacrifice que font des peuples pour faire entendre leurs droits. Tout à l'heure, j'entendais une question, c'est pourquoi est-ce que les gens reconstruisent leurs maisons? Ils reconstruisent leurs maisons pour défendre leurs droits. Donc, apprenons ensemble à faire comprendre à la société internationale que c'est en ayant ce respect pour les gens, en ayant ce respect pour le droit, que nous aurons la capacité aussi de construire un monde de justice, un monde d'égalité et un monde de fraternité. Et je pense que c'est ça que nous sommes en train d'essayer de construire ensemble, de tisser ici. Et puis tout à l'heure, une autre question était venue. La question était celle très pertinente, relative à mais pourquoi est-ce qu'Israël a pu ainsi obtenir la bombe nucléaire? Et je vois ici le professeur Puissant-Maty. Rappelons-nous, et je l'ai dit à notre prix Nobel de la paix ici présente, rappelons-nous qu'avant ça, quelqu'un d'autre en Irlande avait reçu un prix Nobel de la paix. Et ce prix Nobel de la paix, c'était Sean McBride. Sean McBride, ministre des Affaires étrangères irlandais, avait reçu le prix Nobel de la paix et était un militant pour la paix absolument incroyable. Et il a écrit un livre absolument extraordinaire qui s'appelle « The Nuclear Axis », dans lequel il explique comment la complicité entre l'Afrique du Sud blanche et Israël avait permis à Israël d'avoir l'arme nucléaire. J'ai dit. Je vais passer maintenant la parole à la présidente. Je pense que vous avez décidé de partager la présidence entre vous, mesdames, et donc je vous passe la parole et vous avez le lead de cet après-midi.
Thank you, Professor. Welcome back, everybody, after your lunch. This has been a wonderful morning. I have learned so much, and I want to thank all the presentations this morning. It's excellent. We're still on the subject of security and the war industry. Though the sooner we learn that militarism and war don't provide security, then I think we will really be making advances. The importance of what we're talking about is international law and human rights, the dignity of the human person. And if we are to move away from a war built on militarism, a world built on militarism and built on war, to a world built on international law and human rights, respect for human dignity, that's what we're here for. This afternoon, we will be listening first to Shir Haver from Israel. We were also to hear Jamal Jamuna from Palestine, but tragically he has been denied permission to leave Israel to come here. So it seems like Israel continues with its policies of denying people the right to actually leave Israel and denying many of us, myself included, and thousands of Palestinians the right to go back into Israel. So I wish they'd make up their mind. But we are going now to listen to Shir Haver from Israel in his presentation, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Shir Haver, and I work at the Alternative Information Center, a joint Palestinian-Israeli organization. And Jamal Juma, who was supposed to speak here with me on the same topic, he's the director of Stop the Wall, a Palestinian organization against the wall of separation and for the rights of Palestinians. So I have received his presentation as well, and I will give you a summary of both our presentations, so I apologize for speaking longer than most speakers. Yes, he was not allowed to come, and that's why he gave me his presentation. I want to also say that John Hillary from War on Want said quite a lot of things that I was also planning to say, so that actually frees some more time for me. I will only gloss over what was already said, and I'll try to focus on a bit of other aspects. I'll talk about Elbit Systems. It is a weapons company that was founded in 1967. And let me start by talking a little bit about the sources of information that I used for this presentation. There are several sources. Of course, I'm in debt to the Women's Coalition for Peace and their publications, to Dalit and Merav, who gave presentations before. and also to Stop the Wall and other organizations. But there is also something quite special about Elbit, and that is this is a company that also publishes a lot of information about itself. And a lot of the information that I'm going to give is based on Hebrew publications that were published by Elbit, mainly press releases. Elbit is a privatized company. It's completely privately owned, and as such, it is capable of, it's interested in investors, and it's more open to the public in terms of providing information. Of course, this is not necessarily a full and comprehensive information. The information is biased by the interests of the company itself. Elbit was founded in 1967. That is a very important fact to know about the company, because after the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, Israel started, the government of Israel started its investment in military companies and the Israeli military industries, thus creating the business opportunity for Elbit to prosper. And this beginning of investments in military industry was a result of the Israeli government's assessment that as a result of the occupation of the Palestinian territories and Israel's reluctance to withdraw from these territories promptly, an arms embargo against Israel is likely. We now know in retrospect that this assessment was wrong, because the United States stepped up and gave Israel quite a lot of military aid, starting especially in 1973, but a lot of Israel's military industry dates back to 1967 as a result of that. Let me talk a little bit about the size of Elbit and what kind of company we're talking about. Between 2001 and 2005, the company had annual revenues of around $1 billion every year. That's a very large number. However, its profits were only about 0.1% of their revenues. Their profits during those years were around $1 million every year. That's a very low profit compared to the size of the revenues. That's an important point, because we can learn a lot from it. One way we can look at it is to say that Elbit is poorly run. It's not a very profitable company. I'll get back to that and show what is really the reason for this ratio between profits and revenues. But what we should also make note of is that the company's profits have dramatically increased over the years. And as of 2009, the company gave its shareholders profits which were 30% of its capital. That is an extremely high ratio of profit to capital in any industry. Today, the company is valued at about $1.6 billion. 1.6 billion euros. The CEO is Joseph Ackerman. The biggest stakeholder and the chairman of the board of directors is Michael Federman. The company is very fast growing, and that is the reason why it also didn't show very large profits. What we actually see with Elbit is a company that acts like an empire. They buy out their competitors. They buy small companies which bolster their production capacity and technological capabilities in an attempt to be able to avoid competition, in an attempt to be able to become an ever larger company. And as part of their growth program, they have subsidiaries. For example, a subsidiary in the United States called Elbit Systems of America. And this subsidiary actually helps Elbit enjoy the military aid that the United States gives to Israel. As you know, the United States gives Israel about $3 billion worth of military aid every year. That's not including the special packages that was mentioned before. And on the condition that Israel will use these $3 billion to buy only from American companies, from US companies. By establishing a subsidiary in the United States, Elbit is able to compete for tenders which are designed to provide aid to Israel by the United States. That's a bit of a roundabout way, but there's also subsidiaries in Europe, and Mr. Hillary already mentioned UTAX, which Elbit is the majority holder. UTAX cooperates with the British military to promote the Watchkeeper program, watchkeeper program of UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles. Elbit had in 2005 6,430 workers, which is a large number of workers, of course, but it is comparatively low to the size of the company. And Europe is very important for Elbit. Europe is a very central market for Elbit. I think that's why this company is very relevant to our discussions here. Between 2003 and 2005, only about 10 to 12% of Elbit sales were to Europe. And we don't know how much it is today, but we do know that it has become much more significant. In 2010, there was a reduction in orders from Europe, which cost Elbit 17% of its overall sales. So obviously, their ratio has, of European sales has to be much more than 10%. Okay, so that's just a very brief overview of what Elbit is. But how does it work? What does it do, actually? So Elbit starts by working very closely with the Israeli army. It's not just a private company that operates on its own, but they work extremely closely with Israeli officers, with Israeli units, and they get in touch with soldiers and start to recruit them into the company even before the soldiers complete their military service, even while they're still under contract with the Israeli army. That enables Elbit to get people with certain skills that they deem necessary. It also enables them to get a good assessment of what the army needs or what the Israeli army requires, what the soldiers feel, what kind of technology the soldiers feel that they need. But it also gives them a very good access to sell this equipment to the Israeli army. And selling the equipment to the Israeli army is extremely important for Elbit, not just for the monetary value, but because when they later go on to sell the same equipment to other countries, their first line of marketing that they use is this equipment has already been used by the Israeli army. Since the Israeli army is engaged in constant warfare, constant conflict and attacks, that actually is understood to mean this equipment has been used on live human beings. So Elbit can present themselves as experts with better on-the-ground experience than most European companies, for example, and they can present, for example, the Gaza Strip as a laboratory for their equipment. So that is possible because of their close ties with the Israeli army, which means that Israeli officers can order directly the kind of equipment that they need from Elbit. Elbit also works very closely with Israeli academia, Israeli universities, especially the Technion, which is situated in Haifa, an Israeli school of higher learning in technology, and the Weizmann Institute in Rehovot. Both of these institutions opened special centers for electro-optic research with Elbit to study electro-optic technology, which can be used in Elbit's weaponry. The Technion gave an honorary doctorate to Joseph Ackerman, the CEO of Elbit. Michael Federman, the owner and chairman of the board of Elbit, is also on the board of governors for the Hebrew University and for the Weizmann Institute. The Weizmann Institute also created a program for high school pupils where they get some of training in Elbit factories, studying electro-optics and helping Elbit develop its weapons. And Elbit also sponsors the Atidim program, which is a program for reservist young Israelis who wish to study at the expense of the army in exchange for a contract with the army to later use their expertise on the army's behalf. And Elbit gives them scholarships so that they would study the particular kinds of topics which Elbit is interested in. The main products that are produced by Elbit include simulators for aircraft, especially for the F-16 fighter plane and for other aircrafts, and also helmets. Helmets which are supposed to help the pilot see the targets more clearly and strike them. Mr. Hillary before mentioned the F-35 fighter airplane, the stealth fighter, which is now quite famous and quite important to Israel's new weapons acquisitions. Elbit is also, has also signed a deal with Lockheed Martin for producing the helmets for that plane as well. They also produce an electric gun control and a turret engine for the Merkava main battle tank used by Israel. Make no mistake, the fact that this is a main battle tank does not mean that it is mainly used in wars against standing armies. It is actually mainly used against civilian populations, and I'll get back to that later. Elbit also develops the Israeli digital army program, which allows commanders to see what their soldiers are seeing from afar and control them more effectively. And this technology has already been sold to several European countries as well. Perhaps this is a moment just to clarify. The information about Elbit deals with other countries. We do know some of it because they publish information about their deals with the United States, with European countries, but some of it remains hidden. Elbit itself makes it a point to mention some countries which they think would be acceptable and they have nothing to hide in their dealings with, such as the Netherlands or the UK. But they also say, and others, other clients, which they do not specify. And in the year 2000, Israel was the the 10th biggest weapons exporter in the world, but the 4th biggest weapons exporter to developing countries, because many countries are a bit reluctant to sell to militias and dictatorial regimes and so on. But we have no concrete evidence, but a lot of circumstantial evidence that Elbit is still pursuing these kinds of clients. Now, Elbit, once they sell their product to a client, they sell a product with a contract for about 5 years where they maintain that product for the client. Let's say helmets for the airplanes or simulators and so on, with the assumption that after 5 years the client would renew the contract for new and developed weapons. So the business model of Elbit is based on the idea that weapons have to become obsolete quite quickly. New weapons must be developed at all times. Technology development in the weapons industry has to proceed at a fast rate. That is not unique to Elbit by any means, but what is very specific to Elbit is the use of human beings as a laboratory or lab animals, if you will, for this new technology, which gives them an edge while selling this technology. So I was talking about the tank controls, the turret controls that Elbit is producing. Elbit also produces of course, the UAVs, the unmanned aircraft, unmanned aerial vehicles, or drones. These are extremely important, but Mr. Hillary already mentioned them. Let me just reiterate about the Hermes 1500, the most famous drone and one of the most recent ones. The Hermes 1500 is capable of carrying a payload of 350 kilograms and can stay in the air carrying that payload for up to 24 hours. And the meaning of this is that this is actually a dual-use weapon. It's not just to be used for surveillance or even for bombing and attacking a target, but it can also be used as a missile. And as such, a missile which is capable of traveling for 24 hours is considered under international conventions as a weapon of mass destruction, and therefore needs to be subject to certain regulations and to certain controls by the international legal communities. And last but not least, Elbit has become very involved in the homeland security industry. The homeland security industry is a very rapid growing industry. Israel is now considered the world capital of homeland security, and Elbit is producing a lot of special equipment for homeland security uses, which means surveillance equipment, seaport and airport controls, border controls, including databases on passengers. So, for example, if Ms. McGuire would try to cross the border, it would probably be an Elbit database that would put up a red flag saying that she's not allowed to enter Israel. Electric fences and UAVs, which are not only sold for military use, but also for police. And that should be considered also in light of what I said before about UAVs being capable of being used as weapons of mass destruction. So this is the homeland security aspect of Elbit products. Elbit is a classic company which profits from war. And Elbit, that's not unique for weapon companies, of course. Weapon companies generally profit from war and strife. But, and we can see that, for example, with Elbit, that in the third quarter of 2008, while the international global economic crisis was at its height, Elbit's profit rose by 35%. First quarter of 2009 rose by another 34.5%. That is, of course, quite contrary to what happened to the profits of almost any other company in the world. With the exception of weapon companies, which seem to have been able to keep their sales even as people were uncertain about their economic future and losing their homes, for example. So that's important to note, and it's also important to note that Elbit's connection, incentive for war is much stronger and more tight than most companies, because for Elbit it's not just about having customers who, being in a state of war, they need to buy more weapons, but also having their production based on war, having their production process based on using these weapons against actual people. I want to give some examples of what the weapons produced by Elbit actually do, and these are unfortunately very few examples. Now, usually the army does not advertise after it has engaged in an attack. This person was killed by a bullet made with this company, and that person was killed by a missile from that company. So there is some conjecture involved, of course, but what we do know for certain is that Israel is extensively using the UAVs produced by Elbit, and we do know that the Israeli main battle tank is controlled by electronics produced by Elbit. So let's start with those tanks. In the attack on Gaza in the winter of 2008-2009, Dr. Abu Aish, a medical doctor working from Gaza, working in Israel and healing Israeli patients, lost his daughters in a shelling by an Israeli tank on his home. 3 daughters of his died, his niece died, and 2 of his daughters were injured. This was an attack by a tank against a civilian home. Also, during that attack, during that attack on Gaza, there were tank shellings on the UN school in Jabalia, where up to 40 people were killed. Jabalia refugee camp. Human Rights Watch reports that in several cases, Israeli tanks fired upon civilians after the civilians have surrendered, waved white flags, and complied with the orders of Israeli soldiers. And afterwards, they were still fired upon. There were also some attacks by UAVs. The UAVs actually are supposed to be more precise than than other weaponry. They're supposed to give a very good image to the soldier operating them, and they can decide whether they're attacking a civilian or a soldier. And yet, like Mr. Hillary said, the kill ratio is telling quite a different story. In Lebanon, in 2006, Israel attacked at least tens of cases of UAV bombings, where the drones were armed with a rocket that was fired directly at people. That was also used in Gaza. In the attack on Lebanon, an 85-year-old man and his daughter were killed, and their family was injured. When rescuers came to try to rescue the injured people from the rubble, the drone came back and fired at them and killed 2 of the rescuers. Drones also attacked, drones surveyed a neighborhood in South Beirut, given a picture, so the Israeli soldier knew that this was a populated neighborhood full of civilians, and yet the neighborhood was shelled and 39 civilians were killed. In Gaza, the first day of the attack on Gaza was also the bloodiest day, and there was a ceremony of police graduates who were attacked directly by drones. Almost 100 policemen were killed within minutes by these drones. There were at least 42 documented drone attacks in Gaza during that, which killed 87 people, injured many more. In at least 3 cases, Human Rights Watch found evidence that the drones fired on children playing on roofs. and in one of those attacks, 5 children were killed and 2 of them lost their legs. And very important is also to mention Elbit's role in building the wall of separation. I won't repeat all the hardships and the problems that the wall is causing, and I'm sure you're all aware of the illegality of the wall of separation as was declared by the International Court of Justice. And that was also the reason, and I will conclude with that, that there has been some action to divest from Elbit. This divestment started with the Norwegian pension fund, the Norwegian sovereign pension fund, which in 2009 decided that based on their ethical charter, they cannot invest in a company that is involved in criminal behavior, and that will be further elaborated by the speaker after me, so I won't talk more about that. The Norwegian pension fund was later followed by several Swedish and Dutch pension funds as well, which made, again, a moral decision to divest from Elbit. But in 2010, Deutsche Bank, the biggest bank in Germany, also decided to divest from Elbit. And that's a point worth explaining, because Deutsche Bank did not make a moral decision. Deutsche Bank did not decide to divest because of Elbit's behavior. They decided to divest as a business decision because they believe that now that more and more organizations are starting to divest from Elbit, their property value is likely to plummet. And I think we should be very careful not to fall behind the business decisions. The business decisions usually come last. The moral decisions should be first. And if we're already at a case where banks are divesting because they don't want to lose money, it means that the case against Elbit has to move forward more quickly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shreer. And thank you for reminding us of the moral question. When you were reading your report, I was thinking, you know, we have become technological giants and moral and ethical infants. Not only Israel, but all of us and our governments in this madness of militarism. So thank you for reminding us of our moral responsibility. A very excellent report, thank you very much. And it again reminds us of the great debt we owe to people like yourselves, the activists within Israel and Palestine, who are taking a stand against great odds. So we admire you deeply, so thank you for what you're doing. Can we just say that Jama Jumal from Palestine, we're very sorry that he has been denied permission. We wish him all the best, and that the Russell Tribunal will look at this problem, that when we invite people to come to give testimony, they're not allowed out of their country. This should not exist in the 21st century. I would like to ask a question about, please, the drones. Quite apart from the fact I don't know how someone could sit in America at a computer desk and drop drones on unarmed civilians in any country. It is beyond my understanding. But I would like to know about the diamonds and drones connection here. We know that diamonds constitute 35% of Israeli exports, and there are both gem and industrial diamonds. I would like to ask you, please, Cher, if you would address the question, how are industrial diamonds essential for Israel's armament industry, in particular in laser technology for the drones and for the surveillance equipment?
Well, a lot of that information is not disclosed to the public. Israel's diamond exports are indeed quite significant, especially considering the fact that Israel has no raw diamond deposits. All the diamonds are imported into Israel. But the 35 billion figure that you mentioned is the overall export. If you look at the net export, which means the value of exported diamonds minus the value of imported diamonds, it's not as a significant export for Israel as others. And in fact, it's not Israel's biggest export, contrary to what might seem from just the aggregate numbers. the role of the diamond industry in Israel's security industry is not quite clear, but what we can say, and that also following the fact that Israel has a very large part of its economy dedicated to defense and security and militarism, is that every time Israel exports a diamond, and every time somebody buys a diamond that was exported from Israel, some of that money ends up in the Israeli military. So the financial connection is quite there. Recently, I've tried to make a calculation of how much that would be. And overall, the Israeli diamond industry contributes about $1 billion annually, it's a very rough estimate, to Israel's military and security industry, to prisons, to the wall of separation, and so on.
Mairead,
some other questions.
yes, anyone else? Questions, please? Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. It's a follow-up on the diamond issue. Very pleased this has come up. And certainly those who presented earlier on the financial system should also take note, and we might require further information. But I note from your written report that the connections between Elbit and the rest of the world are basically South and North America and parts of Asia. I want to come to the issue of Africa. The blood diamond issue. I'm not going to mention specific African states, Central and West Africa. Connections with the Israel military. It's been noted that in those countries there's developing military assistance. These are countries that have very little to pay with. The blood diamond is an issue. It's needed, we need to look into this further. And the question, following on the chairperson's question to you, is that specific link. It's international. I'm raising the African angle as well. But whatever you might be able to say on that at present, perhaps you've answered. So I'm really raising the flag in terms of how very important this is. And by the way, some of these African countries are ones that in the past benefited from solidarity actions internationally, and at a certain stage were very pro the Palestinian struggle. Now I'm being objective here. I'm just wanting to get a picture of what is happening. And the blood diamond issue is a very evil issue, as we all know.
Well, let me give you a very brief comment on that. In Israel, every officer of a rank of colonel or higher can almost automatically receive a permit from the Ministry of Defense to trade in arms. And the arms trade industry in Israel should be, is of course very connected to the arms production industry, but it's not the same. Elbit is mainly an arms production industry, and the arms traders may buy Elbit equipment and sell to African countries in exchange for raw diamonds, which would definitely qualify them as blood diamonds, but they might just as well use equipment from other companies, not necessarily Elbit. So we should make a clear separation here. Israel is a member of the Kimberley process. Now, actually, this year, Israel was selected to be the chair country of the Kimberley process to avoid trade in blood diamonds. I think that's problematic because the Kimberley process forbids the trading of diamonds from conflict areas, and I would definitely say that Israel is a conflict area.
Thank you very much.
I have a question.
Okay.
I would just like to chime in a little bit on this issue of blood diamonds. There is an African connection, yes. That's where most of the diamonds come from. But there's also a London connection, a Brussels connection, an Antwerp connection, and this is a cash business. And much of the modernity that we can see in Tel Aviv is derived directly from this illicit, blood-stained trade. So I am glad that it arose. I'm just sorry that I wasn't the one to bring it up, that none of the jurors brought it up, but that we have member of the audience, an astute member of the audience who understood that no discussion was going to be complete without this component about blood diamonds. The question I have relates to the drones that are being used by the United States and killing people in Pakistan. Are those drones manufactured by an Israeli company, do you know?
Once again, governments rarely advertise which particular weapon they use was bought from which particular company when they talk about their operations, which they rarely do. I do know that a lot of Israeli companies are involved in that. That Elbit, for example, is very well connected with Lockheed Martin, which produces drones as well. There's also another Israeli company called Aeronautics and several others that also produce drones and drone components. So even if specifically the Hermes 1500 is not used in Pakistan or Afghanistan, and I just don't know, it might be, then components produced by these companies might definitely be used. But since the British Army is also deployed in Afghanistan and on the border of Pakistan, and they are using the Watchkeeper program, the Watchkeeper program we know does utilize Elbit products, so at least when it comes to the British Army, we do know that these drones are used.
I don't want to belabor the point, but it just makes me have to ask this question. Do we have these wars and this killing for these companies, or why do we have a war on terror? Why do we have these wars and the destruction that goes along with it, and these people are making profits?
This is a much bigger question that I can possibly begin to answer here. But I wouldn't be quick to say that all wars are a result of greed in a direct way. I think greed plays a very important component, and the people who profit from war definitely contribute to the fact that we experience so many wars. I think that human beings are usually more complex than just formulas, and their decisions are based on varied reasons, so we shouldn't be quick to reduce people to a very simplified form. I do think that the United States aid to Israel, that's a topic that was raised before, plays a very important role here, because the US aid to Israel is actually a subsidy to weapon companies in the United States, because Israeli citizens don't enjoy it. The fact that there are more deadly airplanes above their heads gives them no further security. And so one thing that should be mentioned is that the lobby within the United States of AIPAC, the pro-Israeli lobby, seems to wield a lot of power, and some people develop these theories as if AIPAC is actually in control of the United States, which I don't agree with. But Lockheed Martin has a lobby 100 times bigger than AIPAC. Why would the United States president, the United States president would probably be uncomfortable giving talks to Lockheed Martin and saying, we will promote your interests? That wouldn't look so good. But if he goes to AIPAC and says the US is an eternal ally of Israel, that is okay within US politics, and the end result is that Lockheed Martin takes the profits.
Thank you very much. You've ended. Sorry, okay, yes.
I would just like to follow up. I'd like to follow up briefly. One understands that as a result of the Gaza flotilla, Turkey has terminated its relations with Israel, and this has had an impact on the purchase of drones. Does this send out a message to the company that it has to take into account the illegality of Israel's operations?
Well, first of all, it should be mentioned that Elbit has been producing UAVs for Turkey for many years, and Elbit also mentioned that these particular UAVs were used by Turkey in its southeastern border. Let's not close our eyes to the war crimes committed by Turkey against the Kurdish population as well for many years, and then, of course, Turkey made no moral objections about the use of UAVs against civilians. But now that Turkey has made some reduction in its relations with Israel and some slowdown, I wouldn't say even a complete stop, of its military relations with Israel, this does affect military companies, and Elbit included, but I don't think that Elbit is the company that would later go to the Israeli government and say you shouldn't attack civilians on the flotilla, because after all, actually the opposite is the result, because after the attack on the flotilla, weapon companies, I don't know which ones, they didn't identify themselves, but Elbit might have been one of them, proposed new technology that the Israeli army could have used in order to avoid the flotilla embarrassment by using more sophisticated weaponry. That's the sort of logic that is being used.
Thank you very much indeed. That was an excellent report. Thank you very much. And I believe one of the new technologies to be used are dogs now, so that's very interesting. So we have Paul Troop, please, to come and give his presentation.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'd better start off by introducing myself. I'm a barrister, and I practice, amongst other things, international criminal law and criminal defence. But I should also clarify two particular points, because I don't, unfortunately, think the introduction that I've been given is entirely accurate. And this is something which the jury may want to examine a little bit more closely. But the introduction is that I will discuss recent court cases against UK-based arms manufacturing companies, Edo, ITT, and Raytheon. Now, much as some may wish this situation to have been the case, unfortunately, it hasn't been the case, and actually the truth of the matter is that the cases that I've been involved in have been defending individuals who've been prosecuted for causing damage to those arms companies. So that's the background which I'll give to you. The second thing I'll say is that I was the lawyer, or one of the lawyers, that was involved in both of these cases. And we also, fortunately, have one of the individuals who was one of the defendants, not my client, but one of the individuals, Chris Osmond. He is much more familiar with the information concerning the companies, because it's not something which is terribly transparent. But in terms of experts, I think he can provide more expertise than I could, so he'll speak after me. So the background to both of these cases was, of course, probably, you can imagine, the conflict in Gaza and the Israeli attack on Gaza at the end of 2008 and the start of 2009. And the events in Gaza prompted two separate actions in two different places. The first was in Derry, in Northern Ireland, where a company called Raytheon UK is based. Raytheon is a subsidiary of the United States company, Raytheon Corporation. And at the time that the Israelis were attacking Gaza, a number of individuals, actually all female, tried to break into the company and cause damage to it, with the aim, they said, when they were arrested by the police, of preventing it from assisting the Israeli army in terms of the support it was giving to the arms that was provided by Raytheon to the Israeli military. They were subsequently charged with burglary. The second criminal case arose in Brighton, in England, and that was at the premises of Edo ITT. Again, Edo ITT was a subsidiary of the enormous American arms manufacturer, ITT Corporation. The individuals in that case were, in terms of their aims, were much more successful. They were able to gain access to the property at night when no one else was around, and armed with axes and hammers, they were in the premises for a couple of hours and caused a tremendous amount of damage before they were eventually arrested and taken to the police station by the police. They too, when they were interviewed, and also on a video recorded before they went into the factory, said that they were acting to stop the company assisting war crimes taking place in Gaza by the Israeli military. Just coming back to the difference between these cases and the fact that, of course, the company wasn't on trial, I'd just like to make 3 points. First of all, as I said, it was individuals who were on trial. It wasn't the company. Secondly, in these cases, because of the nature of a criminal trial, it was the burden on the prosecution, beyond reasonable doubt, to prove the case. And thirdly, the focus of a criminal trial is, of course, what was in the minds of the people as at the time that they went into the company, even if the company later says, well, we're not involved in this material. So those are 3 reasons where it essentially takes 3 steps back from the position where you could say this was a case where the company was on trial. So it's subject to those 3 points, but Chris, I think, will expand a little bit more about the nature of what he believed and what the other individuals believed the company was responsible for. Now, in terms of links, there is, of course, no dispute that the parent companies of both these subsidiaries do openly supply colossal amounts of weaponry to the Israeli military. But in relation to the UK companies, there are real difficulties in showing the links. One reason, for example, is that the police are simply not interested in investigating these matters. My client had specifically gone to the police with the information he had and said, listen, this is the information I have. Would you please look at what this company was doing? And he was essentially laughed out of the police station. Of course, these matters aren't transparent at all. The political system that we have for oversight, in the United Kingdom at least, is not at all adequate in enabling anybody to get a clear picture of what these companies are actually doing. And finally, there are political and economic interests. In terms of the UK, of course, there are individuals who believe that trade is a good thing, even if it's not necessarily in the most salubrious of goods. So I'll just touch briefly on the links between the 2 companies as believed by the individuals. Chris, of course, will speak in more detail about Edo ITT. But firstly, in relation to Raytheon, I think, of course, the individuals involved had greatly differing levels of knowledge. But I think I can highlight at least 3 elements of the links. First was the Raytheon UK in Northern Ireland was a software centre. And they had what was called a one-company policy, whereby, to make the company more efficient, where one area of the company in another area of the world needed assistance, they could call upon resources from anywhere within the network of companies, and the evidence was that they actually did so. The second was that the assurances which were given to the Northern Ireland government in relation to what Raytheon UK would be doing when they came to Northern Ireland were essentially breached, because the government was told and given assurances that this company was not going to work on weapons, it was going to work on other aspects of the business which Raytheon was involved in. That turned out not to be the case, and Raytheon admitted that they were in fact involved in certain types of weapons production, albeit they denied that they were involved in Israel. But thirdly was something which had happened previously, and that was a previous case involving Raytheon Northern Ireland. What had happened during the Lebanon conflict, where Israel had attacked southern Lebanon, was that a number of individuals had successfully gained access to the Raytheon premises and had caused substantial damage by throwing the server for the company out of the window. When they were subsequently prosecuted, witnesses from the company actually said, yes, damage to this server caused damage to our business in other areas of the world. And that was quite a strong factor in influencing the individuals when they decided to attempt to interfere with Raytheon the second time. I won't touch upon what Edo was suspected of doing in any great detail, because Chris is going to talk about it. But essentially, a lot of it revolved around components, which were the main components, or very important components, in the Israeli bomb rack, which was used by Israeli F-16s extensively in Gaza during that period. The three defences which were relied upon in both cases were the same. The first was protection of property. So where property is being damaged and you believe that it's necessary for you to damage property in order to prevent other damage, then you can have a defence in law. Secondly, there is the defence of prevention of crime. Similarly, slightly different test though, where you believe a crime is being committed and it's reasonable to commit a crime in order to prevent that crime, that can also be a defence. And finally, under common law in the UK, there's a defence of necessity. So where it is necessary in order to prevent loss of life or serious damage to individuals, again, you can have a defence. And the primary matters which the individuals were pointing to were the companies assisting the Israeli military in committing crimes in Gaza. And the crimes in Gaza, of course, were things like attacking civilians and disproportionate force. In all the cases, it wasn't seriously in doubt, even by the prosecution, that the crimes were taking place in Gaza, or had taken place in Gaza. But the focus more on was what the individuals said was happening, which was that the companies, by providing these arms to the Israeli military, they were assisting those war crimes. And by preventing the companies from manufacturing those arms, they were essentially preventing crime. Finally, I'm sure you're all interested to know what the result was in the two cases. And although obviously this is not necessarily an indictment of the companies, and perhaps whether the companies should be indicted is a separate matter for the jury to consider, but in June 2010, a jury in Belfast Crown Court unanimously acquitted all the individuals who had sought to enter the Raytheon premises. And then in July 2010, a jury in Brighton unanimously acquitted some of the defendants, and then finally, on direction of the judge, acquitted the final defendants of criminal damage. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. Well, very interesting, and being from the north, Belfast, it's interesting to me because the Derry campaign was of great interest to many of us. The irony of the fact that we had just come out of over 30 years of violent ethnic political conflict, and many of us were trying to take the arms out of Ireland. We should then receive one of the largest arms manufacturers in the world to come into Derry as a foothold into Ireland. So the connections between what was happening in Raytheon for the future of Ireland, because we don't want Ireland to become a militarised, armed country hosting arms manufacturers. So I would like to, and it says Raytheon is no longer in Derry. So there's many interesting points here. We could talk about the right to protest non-violently, the role of civil community and actually challenging these corporations in the arms race, all that. But there was one, I would like to ask you one question. One of the points that the campaign used was the fact that Derry had a city council, had an ethical investment policy. And how would that help people campaigning against these corporations and multinationals in the arms race? How are local councils having ethical investment policies? How does that help, and is it a tool that could be used?
Well, I should say that my expertise is really in the area of law rather than campaigning, but I think matters like that were very relevant to the trial, because if you're going to go to some lengths that are as extreme as going into a factory and causing hundreds of £1,000s worth of damage, you can't just do it on a whim, and you can't just take the law into your own hands. The law is quite strict. You have to show that you've exhausted every other potential remedy. So in both of the cases, the individuals showed that they had peacefully campaigned, they'd protested, they'd raised it with their politicians, they'd sought to have these policies applied, they'd sought to find out what the company was doing, they had tried to complain to the police and get the police to investigate, and essentially they had exhausted every other possible non-violent route that was available to them. So when it came to cross-examination by the prosecution, it was very difficult for the prosecution to point to something else that these individuals should have done in terms of taking a reasonable course of action.
Thank you, Paul. And we have a question here from Lord Gifford and then Michael. Michael? No.
Yes, sorry. This is a question, Paul, I'm afraid without notice, but I'm sure if you feel unable to answer it, you will say so. It's because of something you said, in other words, that we as a jury have to consider whether companies like this should be prosecuted or indicted, is what the word you used. Myrod's just said, what are the methods of challenge? And we're interested in corporate responsibility. Now, I also know that you have been involved in efforts to get arrest warrants for members of the Israeli military when they are nearly set foot in the United Kingdom. However, they were preempted by other forces at work. However, given your familiarity with this, the question really is this, and we haven't really dealt with it head on so far, and it's the question of obtaining prosecutions, arrest warrants in relation to corporate responsibility for war crimes. Now, do you feel in a position to deal with this?
Well, essentially it's the other side of the coin of these protest cases, because one of the things which we had to do in terms of establishing the defence for the individuals was to show that the individuals within the UK who were working for these companies could be committing criminal offences. Because you cannot have a defence until you can point to a belief that there was a criminal offence being committed that you were acting to prevent. I have been involved, together with a number of other people, in teams which have been seeking arrest warrants for individuals, some of which have been Israeli military individuals who have come to the United Kingdom. The difficulties in terms of prosecuting individuals within the UK are slightly different, obviously. And the reason for that is that where someone from Israel or other countries comes to the United Kingdom, there's quite a narrow range of offences which you can pursue them for. And secondly, the basis on which you can pursue them for is also very narrow, because there are only certain offences which you can seek an arrest warrant for somebody when they're in the United Kingdom. In relation to individuals who are companies in the United Kingdom, the offences are much, much greater, because there's not just the ones where you can pursue suspected individuals for under the Geneva Conventions Act, but you can also pursue them under the International Criminal Courts Act, which is a much, much wider range of offences. And also, it's much easier to show that the individual has jurisdiction, because they don't just need to be in the country, they can be a citizen, they can be residing there. The test is much, much wider. So the difficulties of pursuing, or the potential difficulties of pursuing an individual in a company, tend to be more evidence-based, so collecting the evidence to show that in fact they were assisting individuals in another case, and also political, because for obvious reasons, although of course, as we know, pursuing an Israeli general is also a political hot potato. Pursuing commercial individuals and members of companies who are supposedly making profit for that company is also a political issue. But in theory, you could ask the police to investigate, you could ask the Crown Prosecution Service to prosecute, or you could bring a private prosecution yourself.
And just one follow-up. If the, yes, but you could bring a private prosecution. If the public authority refuses to do so, are there methods of judicially reviewing the decision not to?
Yes, there are. The difficulty in judicially reviewing a public authority in terms of the decision whether or not to prosecute is that the courts give a huge amount of discretion to the prosecution whether or not to prosecute. And it's only where they come to a decision such as effectively that they will never prosecute in any case, which I suspect may be the case in relation to Israel-Palestine. If effective that's what they're doing, then you can judicially review that. And in theory, it is possible to judicially review, but it is difficult because there's such a wide margin of discretion which is given to the prosecutor. The historical protection against that has always been the private prosecution, or historically was the private prosecution, which is, at least if the prosecutor isn't going to do it or the state isn't going to do it, then the individual can do it. But as we're seeing, there are moves afoot to at least limit the extent of private prosecutions in relation to arrest warrants. Whether that will be extended to other cases, if individuals try and bring private prosecutions, we will have to see.
I would like to thank Lord Gifford here to say a few words, because Lord Gifford was actually on the defence team of one of the individuals who entered the Raytheon in Derry, and I would love him to tell us a little bit about that, please.
Well, very quickly, I think that the importance to our deliberations here of Paul's evidence and the experience of these cases is that it helps us to give any guidance that may be important to members of the community who find that they have a subsidiary of a major corporation which is complicit in war crimes, crimes against humanitarian law. What do you do? And the answer is not, as Paul has said, you go straight in and smash up their property. I would never counsel that. Two things. One, as he has said, all peaceful means, all means by way of demonstration, asking questions, writing letters should be attempted. Secondly, the material from the company's own websites can sometimes be devastating in a propaganda on our side. Our jury watched Raytheon's own boastful propaganda as to how precise and destructive its missiles were. And I think that was probably what turned the scales.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much indeed, and our apologies for listing your presentation wrongly. We apologise.
No,
thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Paul. And now we're going to call Chris Osmond, and Chris is from Corporate Watch and Smash IDO ITT. Can we call Chris to his presentation, please? Thank you, Chris.
Yeah. Madam Chair, I have deferred some of my questions in light of the time constraints. Will these witnesses be available at some point so that I can get some of my questions answered? Some of my additional questions. Will we have time either during or after these official proceedings to discuss more with the witnesses?
It was foreseen that there would be, if you respect the timetable.
Yes.
There would be sometimes, but at this moment we are a little bit over the time. And we will try, okay.
Hi there. I've been asked to be brief. Thanks for listening to me. I'm going to explain some of the details about how EDO were complicit in supplying the Israeli military. I've been campaigning against EDO MBM in Brighton for nearly six years now, since 2004. There's been a popular campaign in Brighton involving thousands of people, which has included demonstrations, acts of direct action, lobbying of a local council, handing in complaints to the police. And on 16th of January 2009, after Israel had been engaging in the massacre in Gaza for 2.5 weeks, a group of people from Bristol turned up on my doorstep and said they wanted to get in the way of EDO's supply of weaponry to the Israeli military, and I gave them some support in breaking into the EDO factory. And we were, as Paul said, tried for conspiracy to cause criminal damage and acquitted this year. I'd just like to say my thanks really to those 6 people who had the bravery to get in the way of the Israeli war machine back in January 2009, and particularly to Elijah Smith, who spent almost 2 years in prison on remand before being acquitted for the action. So, on to the company. I'll refer to the company as EDO throughout the talk. It's had lots of names during its history. It was established in Brighton in 1946 as MB Metals Limited, and in 2000 a management buyout by the managing director David Jones formed something called the Emblem Group. And the Emblem Group purchased an American company called Artisan Electronics Corporation. And a couple of years before that, in 1998, MBM in Brighton had purchased a range of products from Lucas Western Gear. Those products were the Ver2 bomb rack, a piece of weaponry exclusively used by the Israeli military on this plane, the F-16. This is the Ver2 bomb rack. And 3 of those bomb racks can be used on the Israeli F-16. And at the side of the bomb rack, you can see there's a fixture in the center of the bomb rack hanging under the wing. And that's a piece of equipment called the ERU-151, the Ejector Release Unit 151, which was another piece of equipment they bought from Lucas Western Gear. And that's the unit which ejects the weapon from the rack. They also purchased a piece of equipment called the Zero Retention Force Arming Unit, which was the subject of one of the key subjects of the decommissioner's trial in Brighton. The Zero Retention Force Arming Unit is essentially the trigger unit of the F-16 Ver2 bomb rack used by Israel. In 2003, MBM and the Emblem Group were purchased by EDO Corporation, a large US arms corporation, who admit that they supply weaponry to Israel. And in 2007, in December, they were purchased by ITT Corporation. EDO Corporation were purchased by ITT Corporation, another US corporation, and their trade, EDO Corporation's trade with Israel, was inherited by ITT. Both of those US corporations are completely open about their supply of weaponry to Israel. However, the British company has had to be much more circumspect in saying that it manufactures equipment which is used by Israel. The reason for MBM's purchase of Artisan Electronics Corporation in the USA was to penetrate the US market, to obtain US government contracts, because Artisan was an American company who had access to US government contracts and was a small business in the USA. Both of those things allowed them to obtain contracts from the US government for the Zero Retention Force Arming Unit, which were delivered to the Defense Supply Center Columbus in the US. And those contracts went on until their buyout by ITT, and those contracts now have been inherited by ITT in the US. The advertising on Edo's website was telling. The advertising on their website, up until 2004, when the protest started, advertised the Vertu bomb rack on the Brighton company's website. In 2004, when the first protest took place, myself and some other people locked ourselves to metal fencing in the road that Edo is situated on and prevented traffic from going into the factory. And around the time of that protest, the Vertu bomb rack was taken off their website. Since then, there's been a systematic clearing up of the company's website. Some of the things which have been deleted from the website are references to the Zero Retention Force arming unit being actively manufactured in Brighton. And however, the US website, up until Edo was bought by ITT, said that the Zero Retention Force arming unit, the contact details for that arming unit were Brighton, and the applications for the arming unit were the Israeli Air Force VER-2 bomb rack. All of this we put to the company. We wrote to them in 2004, and they said, we don't deal with Israel. However, we didn't believe them because their website was clear that the bomb rack, the arming unit was manufactured in Brighton. And during the decommissioner's case, the managing director, Paul Hills, was cross-examined for 5 days during the case, and he said that the manufacture of the ZRFAU was done in America by Artisan Corporation. We disagree. We say that Artisan was a front company to penetrate the US market for Edo. However, in terms of Edo's complicity in what's going on, that doesn't really matter, because Paul Hills, the managing director, admitted during the court case that Edo were the design authority for the Vertu bomb rack and for the ZRFAU. And that was how he explained the fact that on their website it said, if you want one of these Zero Retention Force arming units, phone up Paul Hills in Brighton. And the judge in the case said quite reasonably, well, what would you do if someone phoned up and said, if the Israeli army phoned up and said, we'd like one of these arming units, would you send them to America? And he said, Paul Hills said, no, we would qualify the installation for the Zero Retention Force arming unit. You can't simply make one of these units. You have to qualify the installation, and for example, we would tell them how you fit it onto a bomb rack. And he was saying that the company would pass technical data from Edo in Brighton to a buyer. He also admitted that no export licenses for the Zero Retention Force arming unit had been applied for. The export of data in relation to military equipment such as the Zero Retention Force arming unit requires an export license. So it seems that Mr. Hills admitted to exporting technical data without a license during the case. I'll move on to the final piece of equipment that I wanted to talk about, the field replaceable connector system, this little cable that you can see here. The FRCS was invented in Brighton by two men called John Eaton and Michael Cruttenden. It was patented in the UK, the US and Israel. In October 2009, ITT, the parent company of Edo MBM, was awarded a fixed-price contract from Lockheed Martin to supply these weapons release systems, and that contract extended to up to 3,000 sets of these umbilical cables. During the trial under cross-examination, Mr. Hills said that the purpose of the cable is to provide coordinates to the guidance unit, which is on the weapon. So to provide information about the target to the weapon from the plane itself. In October 2010, Israel agreed to buy 20 F-35 fighters for $2.8 billion from Lockheed Martin in the US. These F-35 fighters are a replacement for Israel's F-16 as their main attack weapon. The FRCS, according to ITT press releases, is manufactured in Brighton, at MBM in Brighton. The export licenses, one would assume, for the export from Brighton to Lockheed Martin give the end user as America, not Israel. However, inside sources, inside Lockheed Martin, have confirmed that the FRCS units on the F-35 on the F-35 are the Brighton FRCS units. In fact, they're the only company that manufacture this piece of equipment for Israel's new main attack weapon. And I want to ask the tribunal two things. The campaign is complaining to Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs Department in relation to illegal exports and exports without a license from EDO, and I'd ask the tribunal to make representations in support of the complaint. And also, to everybody in the room, I'd say that it's the actions of ordinary people, of individuals, that are the light at the end of the tunnel in the struggle against Israeli apartheid and occupation. Not the actions of representatives or politicians, but the actions of people like us.
Thank you very much, Chris. Your passion comes across very well. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Sorry we haven't time for questions because the agenda is so packed. But thank you very much indeed, and your passion definitely comes across. We'll take a little bit of it and go home and increase our work. Thank you very much. We're calling for the Ben Hayes from the UK now, and this will be the last presentation before the break.
Okay, distinguished members of the Tribunal, thank you for inviting me here today to talk on the subject of EU subsidies for Israeli security companies. And this is research I've been doing for two organisations, the Civil Liberties Group State Watch and the Transnational Institute. Now, it may seem tangential, but I'm sure it won't be lost on those of you here today that any judgment that is reached on the companies we've heard about this weekend will raise searching questions about those who subsidise them, not least a European Union committed to even-handedness in the Middle East. So I'm going to begin with some background information about how these subsidies came about. There's essentially nothing new about Israel's participation in what is now known as the European Research Area. This dates back to a formal cooperation agreement between EU and Israel of 1995. And indeed, the European Union is now the second largest provider of research funding to Israeli academics, institutions and corporations after the Israeli Science Foundation in Jerusalem. What is new is the provision of subsidies in the field of security research and development. Now, when we speak about subsidies, it's important to clarify that EU research programs are funded by all participating states, including in this case Israel, and that contributions are calculated on the basis of GDP. But Israeli actors have proved so adept at getting EU grants that Israel is very much a net recipient of EU funding, and this is particularly the case in the security research field. So security was introduced into the 7th EU Framework Research Programme, also known as FP7, and this runs from 2007 to 2013 with a budget of something over 51 billion euros. Security research has a relatively modest budget of 1.4 billion euros, but given the preoccupation with security in other thematic areas, information technology, transport, energy, space, the total budget is very much higher in real terms. So the EU Security Research Programme, as it is known, has two principal objectives, and this is important because I think these objectives have engendered a structural conflict of interests. The first objective of the programme is to develop new technologies to keep us all safe from crime, terrorism, illegal immigration and the other so-called threats that so preoccupy European governments. The second objective of the programme is to develop a globally competitive European homeland security industry. And this is very much where Europe thinks it can learn from Israel. So, the million-dollar question, who profits? What I'm just going to do is basically go through some of the projects that have been funded and some of the corporations that are in receipt of these funds. Verint Systems Israel. This is one of the world's leading suppliers of wiretapping, CCTV and workplace surveillance facilities. Verint is leading a €15 million EU project on total airport security, and this will see Israeli security techniques brought to Heathrow and Athens airports. Other participants in this project include Elbit Systems Israel and Israel Airports Authority. Another project, Verint is leading a €20 million project entitled the Emergency Support System. This will see Verint's surveillance technologies used in European command and control centres for so-called crisis management operations. That includes security, public order, policing and so on. And Aeronautics Defence Systems of Israel is another participant in this consortium. Israel Aircraft Industries, that's the state-owned manufacturer of the Heron drone, among other things, which was widely deployed during the last assault on Gaza. Israel Aircraft Industries is involved in several EU security research projects. This includes Talos. This is a €20 million project on autonomous land border controls. The idea here is, believe it or not, that unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs and drones, together with specially adapted combat robots developed by a Polish company, will prevent illegal entry into the European Union by remote control. As John Hillary mentioned earlier, Israel Aircraft Industries is also participating in a €14 million Operus project, and that brings together Europe's leading drone manufacturers with IAI, specifically to develop the technological infrastructure for the deployment of drones along Europe's land and sea borders. Now, I'm talking mainly about security research, but it's also important to point out that these companies participate in many other aspects of European research. Israel Aircraft Industries, for instance, has participated in as many as 50 EU research projects across the aerospace, transport and IT sectors over the last decade or so. Now, just find a few more examples. Elbit Systems, after the presentation you've just heard, I don't think I need to say anything more about this company. Elbit is currently participating in at least 3 EU-funded security research and 2 transport research projects, including the €22 million Protect Rail project. Motorola Israel, producer of the so-called virtual fences around Israeli settlements, is helping the EU to develop novel intruder technologies in a project called iDetect for All. And finally, it's important to point out it's not just Israeli companies. The Israel Counter-Terrorism Academy is participating in an EU project on fighting radical extremism. This is the Sapphire project. Other participants include the likes of the RAND Corporation. I could go on, but I'll refer you instead to my submission, which lists all 19 security projects featuring Israeli actors to date. But I would like you to know that this is a program that's very much in its infancy. We're only 2 years in to what is a 7-year program. And lest there be any doubt about the extent of Israel's involvement in this EU research program, only 4 out of the 27 EU member states have received more EU funding than Israel in this area. And before I conclude, because I know we're way over time, I'd just like to leave you with a couple of thoughts. The first is, how can the European Union justify this? I've talked to numerous European Commission officials about this, and what you basically get is a mix of 3 responses. We may be uncomfortable about what's happening, but from a constitutional perspective, there's nothing we can do because of the EU-Israeli treaties that govern these projects. Second response, well, all of these project proposals are independently reviewed, and at least as far as the tenders are concerned, if Israel comes up with better security projects than anyone else, there's not really a great deal we can do about it. But the third thing they say is that there really is an economic imperative here. If Israel has technologies that we want to use, and this is particularly the case in the area of drones, unmanned aerial vehicles, then the European Union can save billions of euros in research and development costs by incorporating Israel into our own security industrial complex, as I would term it. The second question is, well, what can be done? Now, there's also absolutely no doubt in my mind whatsoever that many of the officials and bureaucrats involved in the EU project, particularly within the European Commission, are deeply concerned about what is happening. So I would defer to you with this thought, that if it could be established that Europe is indeed subsidising the corporate arm of the occupation, then we might see significant traction on this issue. And before I do defer to your judgment, I would suggest that if something is not done, then things are going to get a lot worse. The EU is now discussing the research budget for the period 2014 to 2020, and we are likely to see both a massive increase in the security budget allocation and potentially the establishment of a full-blown EU military research programme. And on that note, I will conclude.
Madam Chair, I have a question. I know we're pressed for time. But I just have one clarification.
Sure.
I was trying to write down these projects, and I'm glad to know that they're in the annex here, so I'll study that. But did I understand you correctly to say that there's a 20 million euro project for autonomous land war controls?
Land border controls.
Land border controls. And then that there's an additional 14 million euro project for land and sea border drones?
Absolutely, yes.
So now, who is the EU afraid of?
Well, if you read European Union policy documents, as I unfortunately do for a living, you will see that the EU presents terrorism, organised crime, but particularly illegal immigration, so-called, as the greatest threat facing the European Union today. And obviously a lot of us in this room might take very different positions, but I'd just like to say something, if I may, about the Talos project that you mentioned, because when this got funded, remember this is 20 million for combat robots and drones for border control. And I rang up a contact I have very close to the security research program, and I said, I cannot believe that you funded this. How on earth did it get through your ethical guidelines? And the response that I got was, you should have seen the original proposal. There were electromagnetic shock weapons on these combat robots, and we told them that these had to go before the proposal could be funded. But that is very much the kind of research and development that we're talking about here.
The only thing that I would, I mean, this is like totally astounding to me, but you know, eventually every one of these EU politicians ought to be fired by the people of these various countries. And if they're not fired, then what will happen here is what is already happening in the United States, and that is that these drones And these invasive machines will be used against you as they are being used against the people of the United States.
I couldn't agree more.
We have another question here.
Sorry about that.
Just a very quick question. Something that has not been touched on by this tribunal is the involvement of Israeli universities in military research. And I think your research shows very clearly that several Israeli universities are deeply involved in military research. Is that correct?
That's certainly the case. Obviously, the submission focuses on the corporations, but you will see the Technion Institute, which very much has a close relationship with Elbit Systems. You will see that's a name that crops up very often in terms of EU security research. Ben Gurion University, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, they're all in there. And it's very much a sort of a marriage of academia, corporations, and what they call end users, which are the security services and so on.
Thank you.
I would like to ask a question about the connection between this research and the funding for it, much of which happens in the settlements as well as Israel proper. I would like to ask you, is there a connection between what's happening here and NATO? We're all concerned about what's happening in NATO in Europe, a militarization literally of Europe. America has 6 nuclear weapons in European states. Germany currently wants rid of the Americans off Germany, but America won't comply. So the whole growth of the NATO, the military force, and we know that Israel is interested in becoming a member of NATO. Can you please kind of speak to what is the connection between the technological advancements being used by the money out of Europe that Israel's using, and where's the connection between Israel's policies and NATO?
Well, I think there's 2 things happening. The first thing that's very obvious is that defence and arms companies have seen a potential decline in profits and recognised equally that homeland security is going to be a huge, massive global industry. And you'll even hear arms company executives use phrases like, security is the new defence. In respect to NATO, what you can see happening really is an outdated military alliance jumping on what are effectively crimes, organised crime, terrorism, illegal immigration, even things like climate change, to justify its existence for the next decades to come. The final thing I think that's related to this is, and this was touched on by a previous speaker, so much of this agenda is being set by the corporations. You really have the EU saying, well, should we have a security research program? What should it look like? And then you have this huge conflict of interests where corporations are invited to set the objectives for the research program, then apply for the funding on offer, then use the stuff they develop in terms of the research and sell it back to the very member states that use the taxpayer budget to fund the research in the first place. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. There's only one word that comes to mind. I think we've lost sight of it. It's called shame. And it's called shameful of what's happening and what's happening with the arms race. So we only have a 10 minutes break to return to the next session. Thank you very much indeed for your excellent presentation. We were also to hear Jamal Jamuna from Palestine, but tragically he has been denied permission to leave Israel to come here. So it seems like Israel continues with its policies of denying people the right to actually leave Israel and denying many of us, myself included, and thousands of Palestinians the right to go back into Israel. So I wish they'd make up their mind. But we are going now to listen to Shir Hever from Israel in his presentation, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Shir Hever, and I work at the Alternative Information Center, a joint Palestinian-Israeli organization. And Jamal Juma, who was supposed to speak here with me on the same topic, he's the director of Stop the Wall, a Palestinian organization against the wall of separation and for the rights of Palestinians. So I have received his presentation as well, and I will give you a summary of both our presentations, so I apologize for speaking longer than most speakers. Yes, he was not allowed to come, and that's why he gave me his presentation. I want to also say that John Hillary from War on Want said quite a lot of things that I was also planning to say, so that actually frees some more time for me. I will only gloss over what was already said, and I'll try to focus on a bit of other aspects. I'll talk about Elbit Systems. It is a weapons company that was founded in 1967. And let me start by talking a little bit about the sources of information that I used for this presentation. There are several sources. Of course, I'm in debt to the Women's Coalition for Peace and their publications, to Dalit and Merav, who gave presentations before, and also to Stop the Wall and other organizations. But there is also something quite special about Elbit, and that is this is a company that also publishes a lot of information about itself. And a lot of the information that I'm going to give is based on Hebrew publications that were published by Elbit, mainly press releases. Elbit is a privatized company. It's completely privately owned, and as such, it is capable of, it's interested in investors, and it's more open to the public in terms of providing information. Of course, this is not necessarily a full and comprehensive information. The information is biased by the interests of the company itself. Elbit was founded in 1967. That is a very important fact to know about the company, because after the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, Israel started, the government of Israel started its investment in military companies and the Israeli military industries, thus creating the business opportunity for Elbit to prosper. And this beginning of investments in military industry was a result of the Israeli government's assessment that as a result of the occupation of the Palestinian territories and Israel's reluctance to withdraw from these territories promptly, an arms embargo against Israel is likely. We now know in retrospect that this assessment was wrong, because the United States stepped up and gave Israel quite a lot of military aid, starting especially in 1973.
Take your seat, please. Don't hesitate, please. Virginie. Thank you very much. Some of you, maybe John can see it too. Hello, John. Please, could you sit? So, thank you very much. Thank you. And silence, thank you very much. Could you now stay up, please? Thank you. Thank you very much. You can sit and thank you very much, jury. Permettez-moi de vous lire rapidement un petit message que nous recevons de la part d'un membre du jury qui n'a pas pu nous rejoindre, Aminata Traoré, qui est victime d'un problème grave du dos et qui doit se soigner. Elle nous dit: chers amis et membres du jury du tribunal Russell sur la Palestine, c'est avec un profond regret que j'ai dû renoncer à participer à la deuxième session internationale du Tribunal Russell sur la Palestine à Londres. La gravité des événements qui se sont déroulés depuis la première session à Barcelone, dont notamment l'attaque de la flottille, ainsi que l'importance de la responsabilité des multinationales dans le drame palestinien, m'incitait à être présente. Je tenais tout particulièrement à revoir et à saluer Mariette Maguire pour l'acte de courage qu'elle a posé en tentant d'acheminer à son tour à Gaza des biens dont ses habitants sont privés. Je souhaite donc un franc succès aux travaux en cours et me promets de prendre ma place parmi vous. Avec mes meilleures salutations, Aminata Traoré. Je voulais aussi vous dire deux choses avant de passer la parole à la présidente. La première, c'était que vous allez rentrer chez vous demain ou ce soir. Vous allez, après avoir assisté aux travaux du tribunal, vous allez devoir rendre compte. L'importance de rendre compte, c'est de pouvoir à la fois appeler un journaliste, à la fois appeler un parlementaire, à la fois appeler un membre d'un cabinet d'un gouvernement.
And we don't know how much it is today, but we do know that it has become much more significant. In 2010, there was a reduction in orders from Europe, which cost Elbit 17% of its overall sales. So obviously, their ratio of European sales has to be much more than 10%. Okay, so that's just a very brief overview of what Elbit is. But how does it work? What does it do, actually? So Elbit starts by working very closely with the Israeli army. It's not just a private company that operates on its own, but they work extremely closely with Israeli officers, with Israeli units, and they get in touch with soldiers and start to recruit them into the company even before the soldiers complete their military service, even while they're still under contract with the Israeli army. That enables Elbit to get people with certain skills that they deem necessary. It also enables them to get a good assessment of what the army needs or what the Israeli army requires, what the soldiers feel, what kind of technology the soldiers feel that they need. But it also gives them a very good access to sell this equipment to the Israeli army. And selling the equipment to the Israeli army is extremely important for Elbit, not just for the monetary value, but because when they later go on to sell the same equipment to other countries, their first line of marketing that they use is this equipment has already been used by the Israeli army. Since the Israeli army is engaged in constant warfare, constant conflict and attacks, that actually is understood to mean this equipment has been used on live human beings. So Elbit can present themselves as experts with better on-the-ground experience than most European companies, for example, and they can present, for example, the Gaza Strip as a laboratory for their equipment. So that is possible because of their close ties with the Israeli army, which means that Israeli officers can order directly the kind of equipment that they need from Elbit. Elbit also works very closely with Israeli academia, Israeli universities, especially the Technion, which is situated in Haifa, an Israeli school of higher learning in technology, and the Weizmann Institute in Rehovot. Both of these institutions opened special centers for electro-optic research with Elbit to study electro-optic technology, which can be used in Elbit's weaponry. The Technion gave an honorary doctorate to Joseph Ackerman, the CEO of Elbit. Michael Federman, the owner and chairman of the board of Elbit, is also on the board of governors for the Hebrew University and for the Weizmann Institute. The Weizmann Institute also created a program for high school pupils where they get some of training in Elbit factories. studying electro-optics and helping Elbit develop its weapons. Elbit also sponsors the Atidim program, which is a program for reservists, young Israelis who wish to study at the expense of the army in exchange for a contract with the army to later use their expertise on the army's behalf. And Elbit gives them scholarships so that they would study the particular kinds of topics which Elbit is interested in. The main products that are produced by Elbit include simulators for aircraft, especially for the F-16 fighter plane and for other aircrafts, and also helmets which are supposed...
Ou un ministre, si vous en avez l'occasion. Et c'est de lui transmettre, pas seulement des impressions, mais de lui dire que vous êtes prêt à lui transmettre des informations qui sont celles que nous collectons ici grâce à tous ces témoignages, grâce à toute l'expertise que nous accumulons, grâce aux conclusions qui vont être tirées par le tribunal. Le tribunal est une initiative populaire et seule l'initiative populaire, aujourd'hui, peut et doit nous amener à faire prendre conscience aux opinions publiques sur le plan international de la gravité des situations, mais pas seulement de la gravité de ces situations, du sacrifice que font des peuples pour faire entendre leurs droits. Tout à l'heure, j'entendais une question, c'est pourquoi est-ce que les gens reconstruisent leurs maisons? Ils reconstruisent leurs maisons pour défendre leurs droits. Donc, apprenons ensemble à faire comprendre à la société internationale que c'est en ayant ce respect pour les gens, en ayant ce respect pour le droit, que nous aurons la capacité aussi de construire un monde de justice, un monde d'égalité et un monde de fraternité. Et je pense que c'est ça que nous sommes en train d'essayer de construire ensemble, de tisser ici. Et puis tout à l'heure, une autre question était venue. La question était celle très pertinente, relative à mais pourquoi est-ce qu'Israël a pu ainsi obtenir la bombe nucléaire? Et je vois ici le professeur Pisson-Mati. Rappelons-nous, et je l'ai dit à notre prix Nobel de la paix, ici présente, rappelons-nous qu'avant ça, quelqu'un d'autre en Irlande avait reçu un prix Nobel de la paix. Et ce prix Nobel de la paix, c'était Sean McBride. Sean McBride, ministre des Affaires étrangères irlandais, avait reçu le prix Nobel de la paix et était un militant pour la paix absolument incroyable. Et il a écrit un livre absolument extraordinaire qui s'appelle « The Nuclear Axis », dans lequel il explique comment la complicité entre l'Afrique du Sud blanche et Israël avait permis à Israël d'avoir l'arme nucléaire. J'ai dit. Je vais passer maintenant la parole à la présidente. Je pense que vous avez décidé de partager la présidence entre vous, mesdames, et donc je vous passe la parole et vous avez le lead de cet après-midi.
Thank you, Professor. Welcome back, everybody, after your lunch. This has been a wonderful morning. I have learned so much, and I want to thank all the presentations this morning. It was excellent. We're still on the subject of security and the war industry. The sooner we learn that militarism and war don't provide security, then I think we will really be making advances. The importance of what we're talking about is international law and human rights, the dignity of the human person. And if we are to move away from a war built on militarism, a world built on militarism and built on war, to a world built on international law and human rights, respect for human dignity, that's what we're here for. This afternoon, we will be listening first to Shir Haver from Israel.
But a lot of Israel's military industry dates back to 1967 as a result of that. Let me talk a little bit about the size of Elbit and what kind of company we're talking about. Between 2001 and 2005, the company had annual revenues of around $1 billion every year. That's a very large number. However, its profits were only about 0.1% of their revenues. Their profits during those years were around $1 million every year. That's a very low profit compared to the size of the revenues. That's an important point because we can learn a lot from it. One way we can look at it is to say that Elbit is poorly run. It's not a very profitable company. I'll get back to that and show what is really the reason for this ratio between profits and revenues. But what we should also make note of is that the company's profits have dramatically increased over the years. As of 2009, the company gave its shareholders profits which were 30% of its capital. That is an extremely high ratio of profit to capital in any industry. Today, the company is valued at about $1.6 billion. 1.6 billion euros. The CEO is Joseph Ackerman. The biggest stakeholder and the chairman of the board of directors is Michael Federman. The company is very fast growing, and that is the reason why it also didn't show very large profits. What we actually see with Elbit is a company that acts like an empire. They buy out their competitors. They buy small companies which bolster their production capacity and technological capabilities in an attempt to be able to avoid competition, in an attempt to be able to become an ever larger company. And as part of their growth program, they have subsidiaries. For example, a subsidiary in the United States called Elbit Systems of America. And this subsidiary actually helps Elbit enjoy the military aid that the United States gives to Israel. As you know, the United States gives Israel about $3 billion worth of military aid every year. That's not including the special packages that was mentioned before. On the condition that Israel will use these $3 billion to buy only from American companies, from US companies. By establishing a subsidiary in the United States, Elbit is able to compete for tenders which are designed to provide aid to Israel by the United States. That's a bit of a roundabout way, but there's also subsidiaries in Europe, and Mr. Hillary already mentioned UTAX, which Elbit is the majority holder. UTAX cooperates with the British military to promote the Watchkeeper program of UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles. Elbit had in 2005 6,430 workers, which is a large number of workers, of course, but it is comparatively low to the size of the company. And Europe is very important for Elbit. Europe is a very central market for Elbit. I think that's why this company is very relevant to our discussions here. Between 2003 and 2005, only about 10 to 12% of Elbit sales were to Europe.